One thing that I think turns a lot of people off to modern philosophy is the emphasis on ideas of social construction. We hear this even in popular and political discourse that such and such is socially constructed, such as gender or gender roles, or even certain forms of institutions or proper ways of action or speech. And this is something that postmodern philosophy in general focuses on. And I think that the idea of a discourse is a very helpful way of understanding how this idea of social construction is defined philosophically, and exactly why the postmoderns thought this was so important. And one of the big problems with social construction, or I guess not problems, but things that social construction problematizes, is knowledge itself. If what something is contingent upon its social relations, its relations to a certain field of different items that give it a definition, then it seems that our knowledge is restricted to our domain of inquiry, or our discourse. So I like to think of this as when we're trying to talk about what something is, we like to think that certain times it's more clear than others. We could talk about gender, or we could talk about tables. We could talk about virtue and punishment, or we could talk about a book or a lamp. And within these two different contrasting sort of examples, the latter tends to be something that we feel more easy with regards to. With regards to tables and books and lamps, we like to think that these things have very concrete identities, and these aren't really socially contingent, right? These don't depend at all on the social relations that are around them. A book is just, a book. It seems fairly obvious. But in fact, it is an important element of postmodern philosophy that knowledge is not innocent, and neither is perception as such. That the way we perceive and the way things have identity and definition, and the way that they become to be, is actually defined by the field within which we find them. If we're trying to talk about a table, for example, we can talk about a number of different properties that it has, and we can say that a table is defined, of course, by a definition. So, for example, a table has a flat top and it has 4 legs. We could also talk about what it's used for. We could talk about its place in history or memories or as a pure idea. But importantly, we have things like color or size or shape, which define a particular table, because we can talk about tables as pure ideas, as something with a flat top and 4 legs that you use to lay things on or ride on or prop things up. But a concept like this necessarily is going to be referring to things that we've actually experienced, right? The reason that we have these definitions of a table is because we have empirically come upon all these different particular tables. So a table tends to be flat, and as such, that is our definition. A table tends to have 4 legs, and thus that is our definition. So typically, the way that we actually come to these concepts, which seem to be all-encompassing, is actually through empirical observation. And we sort of average these things out to come up with the definition of a table. But if our ideas or our concepts are beholden to empirical information that have led us to these concepts, we might actually start to think about certain things implicit in our empirical observations that might themselves need explanations. For example, when we talk about extension or size, this is a basic property of something to exist. For something to exist, it has to take up a definite amount of space, right? Now, we could problematize this by talking about, do ideas exist? Things like fictional characters or, other sorts of ideas. But we'll table that for now to say that when we talk about something that is quote-unquote real, we talk about something that necessarily has extension. It necessarily has some kind of existence in space in which it takes up a definite amount of space. But extension is a mere idea, a mere concept, without having some relation to actual entities. For example, our table. And when we talk about extension, we necessarily have to talk about it in specific units. For example, we can say that the table is so-and-so feet tall, or so-and-so inches wide, or so-and-so centimeters thick. The way that we actually come to talk about particular real things is not just by some arbitrary idea of extension in space, but requires us to actually impose a certain sense of order upon something, to make that abstract concept something that actually is in reality. So for something to exist, it must have some order which is presupposed, in a sense, and imposed on that being to give it extension. Think about, for example, a square. We have certain ideas of a square that define it as a pure idea. It has 4 sides which are all equal in length, and it has 4 angles, all of which are right angles. This defines a square. But when we want to talk about the difference between an idea and something that is real, an idea is a pure universal. And we like to think that we can talk about these ideas and, get very far. This is kind of abstract mathematics in its essence. But in fact, this idea of squareness, of being a square, is empty unless we refer it to empirical entities, unless we talk about particular squares. And when we start talking about particular squares that exist, that we have encountered empirically and we have experienced, we necessarily have to start talking about things like extension. So if we take this abstract idea of a square and we turn it into a real entity, we necessarily have to impose some kind of order on it, some kind of structure within which we can understand it. This is the discourse. And in mathematics, this is usually done by imposing something upon a coordinate plane, such as the Cartesian coordinate plane, invented by René Descartes. In the coordinate plane, we have squares, or really vertical and horizontal lines that are equidistant from one another, and we call the distance between one vertical line to the other or one horizontal line to the other a set unit. Maybe this is inches, maybe this is feet, maybe this is micrometers, whatever this is. We can impose this structure upon the abstract square, and now it starts to be something which could represent a real entity. We could take a square object of some kind that exists in the real world, and we can start to talk about it not as a mere abstract concept, but we can actually give substance and give an explanation to exactly what it is by exactly talking about its extension. But, just like we've talked about before, there is no innocent perception. There is no innocent definitions. When we impose this Cartesian coordinate plane behind or over, in a sense, the square, we necessarily create its identity. For example, if we make the distance between each horizontal and vertical line very short, fractions of a unit, the square becomes a small square. If we say that this square is imposed upon a coordinate plane such that it is 1 foot by 1 foot, well, it's a rather small square. But by changing nothing about the square as an abstract concept, but merely changing the coordinate plane upon which it is inscribed, we can actually change the square such that it is now 10 feet by 10 feet. By merely changing the order upon which it is imposed, we fundamentally change what it is. So this is to say that the isness of something, for something to be what it is, and if we're talking about something that exists in the real world, and we're talking about things like extension, or even things like color, we necessarily have to impose an order upon it to be able to talk about it. And of course, when we look at it like this, for example, the particular coordinate plane that we choose to impose upon this square is rather arbitrary. It might depend on certain real-world conditions, but the question can be raised: does the square have an existence independent of the discourse, or does it only have an existence within this discourse, within this coordinate plane which establishes an order upon which we can actually give it a definite being? And thus, there are no things in themselves, the Dingen an sich, as Kant talked about them. There is only the way something is in a field of difference, a differential field. This is what a discourse is. It allows us to differentiate different parts of the entity such that we can talk about what it is by talking about its extension or its relation to other colors, if we want to talk about color, in concrete terms. But even if we want to talk about something like color, for example, blue, blue only is insofar as it has a relation to other colors, or in terms of physics, to an electromagnetic spectrum, to a frequency. And this way of understanding color imposes a certain order on what that color is. For example, if we want to talk about what some color is, let's say this is kind of a weird in-between color that isn't kind of one of our normal colors. And our method for understanding color is a very evenly divided color wheel. There are some colors that we simply cannot talk about, precisely because the place of order from which we come to actually then talk about the color limits our ability to actually talk about colors that go outside of these categories. And thus, postmodern philosophers, and thus those who are typically called post-structuralists, are wary of treating being as something objective, as something that exists outside of social relations. Because when we do this, we actually hide the fact that what it is to be is, in fact, to be defined by an order that relates things to one another as differences. And by attempting to ignore these differences and treat something as something that merely is, we fail to really get out what it actually means for something to be real, for something to have a being and to relate to other things. And thus, many postmodern philosophers, such as Michel Foucault, want to bring in the idea of a discourse to express limitations on knowledge. For example, when we talked about color before, if we have a matrix for talking about color, a very set amount of colors that we can actually talk about, maybe these are ones that exist within the visible spectrum, or maybe these are very definite values of color, we can only talk about certain things as being colorful. Other things which are in-betweens are simply not colors at all because we don't have a method by which to talk about them. Now, obviously, this is going to set certain limitations to our knowledge when we go to, for example, extension, like before, which is to say that if we impose an order on the square like we did before through a coordinate plane, we necessarily make it where the isness of the square is tied up in an order that we have created. And thus, postmodernism is plagued by something which we can talk about being good or bad, which is that knowledge is always subjective. Knowledge is always subject to the relations with which it is oriented within. And thus, people like Foucault are very keen on doing these historical analyses where they analyze how have institutions related to the subjects that they govern, such as how has the prison related to the prisoners? How has it treated them? How has the clinic related to its patients? And thus, what does it mean to be a patient? Because to be a patient is to necessarily be within a clinical institution. And these historical analyses are trying to drive at the subjectivity of things like being ill, being mad, being the subject under the law. Whatever this may be, discourse analysis, which was spawned by Foucault and has since been taken up by people like Edward Said, for example, is aimed at taking a wider analysis of being to relate it to its contingency and potentially its arbitrariness. And thus, we can use this idea of the discourse to deconstruct, so to speak, things which seem to be very concrete. We can use this to attack institutions, which say that certain forms of behavior are, by definition, illegal or bad, precisely by showing that this institution is not some objective, God-given institution, so to speak, but rather that one that has been created, one that may have been created for certain means or for the benefit of certain people. And thus, the discourse is a very fluid concept that can relate to all sorts of different fields, such as anthropology, sociology, post-colonial studies, to talk about the relations of ideas like what it means to be a citizen or what it means to be ethically worthwhile, to forms of power. And all this helps us get a better look at what it means to exist. And thus, Foucault, in an interview, which I can't remember exactly what it was, but he said something like his project was to ask the question, who are we and how did we get here? And by asking the question of how did we get here, we may actually be able to entertain some political projects and make them actually legitimate endeavors by being more of a critical than a constructive thing. By showing the contingency of institutions, ideas, we can dismember things which appear to be objective. And this can be said to be a valid philosophical project in and of itself. And it has been the project of subsequent thinkers like Deleuze and Guattari, for example, or Homi Bhabha, to take up the mantle of the discourse and analyze how we can actually go from here. Because one can make a very valid critique of early postmodernists like Derrida or Foucault to say that they're very good at criticizing, but maybe their way of escaping from this criticism and creating a positive project is a little limited. So with that said, I hope this idea of the discourse is clear to you and that you can use it to understand various things around you and really gain some epistemic humility. See exactly how the things that you take to be infinite and objective and simply the case as something which actually has a very deep relation and a very intimate relation to the world around it. And in this way, we can even understand what it is to be man or woman or teacher or student, these human relations, as something which is just that, a relation. Not something that exists in a vacuum, but something which exists maybe to serve certain other people's means, and thus something which can be carried forth to make very valid analyses of everywhere from institutions to people to ideas. So I hope this has been helpful, and I'll see you in another lecture.